There is a particular kind of exhaustion that quiet people know well. It is not the exhaustion of doing too much. It is the exhaustion of holding too much, of walking through a room and absorbing every tension in it, every unspoken feeling, every small contradiction between what someone says and what their face actually does. And then going home, sitting in silence and processing all of it alone. Nobody asked them to do this. They cannot really stop doing it either. This video is about that experience. Not about shyness, not about social anxiety, not about being broken in some way that needs fixing. It is about a specific psychological pattern, one that has been misread for centuries as weakness, aloofness, or indifference, when in reality it is something closer to the opposite. Let us start with something that rarely gets said plainly. Quiet people are not quiet because they have nothing to say. They are quiet because they are still deciding whether what they have to say is worth the cost of saying it. That is a fundamentally different thing. One is emptiness. The other is discernment. Most social environments reward speed. The person who responds first, who fills silence fastest, who projects the most confidence in the least amount of time. That person tends to be read as capable, interesting, worth listening to. The person who pauses, who thinks before speaking, who chooses words carefully. That person tends to be read as uncertain, distant, or difficult to reach. This is not a small misunderstanding. It shapes careers, friendships, and the way people come to see themselves. Carl Jung spent much of his intellectual life trying to articulate what happens inside people who are oriented primarily toward their inner world. His memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, is not a textbook. It is something more personal, a record of a man trying to understand his own mind, and in doing so, illuminating something universal. One of the things that runs through that work is the idea that the inner life is not a retreat from reality. It is a different kind of engagement with it. The noise of the external world can drown out signals that only become audible in stillness. That is not mysticism. That is observation. Think about what actually happens when a quiet person enters a social situation. While others are performing, managing impressions, filling space, competing for attention, the quiet person is watching. They are tracking the emotional temperature of the room. They are noticing who defers to whom, who laughs a little too hard, who goes quiet when a certain subject comes up. They are building a model of what is actually happening beneath the surface of what is being said. This is not a conscious strategy. It is simply how their attention moves. And it means that by the time they do speak, they are often working from a much richer picture of the situation than anyone around them realizes. The Stoics had a concept they called the discipline of assent, the practice of not reacting immediately to every impression, but pausing to examine whether a response is actually warranted. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea repeatedly in his private writings. The ability to hold a thought without immediately acting on it, to let an emotion pass through without being swept away by it. This was not passivity. It was a form of inner governance, a kind of strength that looks, from the outside, like stillness. Quiet people often practice something like this without ever having read a word of Stoic philosophy. They have simply learned, usually through experience, that not every thought needs to be spoken, not every reaction needs to be performed, and not every silence needs to be filled. But here is where it gets complicated. That same capacity for depth and observation can turn inward in ways that are not always healthy. The person who processes everything carefully can also become the person who overthinks everything endlessly. The person who holds back in conversation can also become the person who holds back from life. Using solitude as a shelter rather than a source of strength. There is a difference between choosing stillness and hiding inside it. Jung was clear on this point, even if he expressed it in his own particular language. The inner world is real and worth exploring, but it is not a destination. It is a resource. The goal is not to disappear into yourself. The goal is to know yourself well enough to move through the world with more honesty and less fear. This matters because quiet people are often told, implicitly or explicitly, that their natural way of being is a problem to be solved. They are encouraged to speak up more, take up more space, perform more extroversion, and sometimes that advice is genuinely useful. There are moments when visibility matters, when speaking first is the right move, when silence is being misread in ways that have real consequences. But the deeper message, the one that gets absorbed over years of being told to be different, is that something is fundamentally wrong with the way they are wired. And that message is false. Nietzsche wrote about the danger of letting the noise of other people's opinions drown out the quieter voice of one's own values. He was not gentle about it. He thought most people spent their lives performing for an audience that was not even paying close attention, sacrificing what was genuine in themselves for approval that was never really satisfying. The quiet person who has learned to sit with their own thoughts, who has developed a relationship with their own inner life, is in some ways better protected against that particular trap. Not immune, better protected, because the trap is real. Solitude can become isolation. Depth can become withdrawal. The person who is most comfortable alone can sometimes use that comfort to avoid the friction of genuine connection. The kind of connection that requires vulnerability, disagreement, and the risk of being misunderstood. Real depth is not just about what you notice. It is about what you do with what you notice. The observation has to go somewhere. The inner life has to make contact with the outer world at some point, or it becomes a very elaborate form of loneliness. So what does this actually look like in practice? It means protecting your solitude without treating it as a fortress. It means giving yourself permission to process slowly in a world that rewards instant response, while also recognizing when slow processing has become avoidance. It means trusting your observations without assuming that because you noticed something, you have understood it completely. And it means finding the people and the spaces where your particular kind of depth is not just tolerated, but genuinely valued. Because those people and spaces exist even if they are harder to find than a loud room full of easy conversation. There is something worth saying about the emotional labor that quiet people carry without much recognition. When you are the person in the room who notices everything, you often end up holding things for other people, absorbing their anxiety, tracking their moods, adjusting your behavior to keep the emotional temperature stable. This is not always a choice. It is often just what happens when your attention is calibrated the way theirs is. And it is exhausting in a way that is very difficult to explain to someone who does not experience it. If that resonates with you, it is worth knowing that the exhaustion is real, the labor is real, and you are not obligated to carry it indefinitely without acknowledgement or rest. The quiet person who has learned to understand their own inner life, who has stopped treating their depth as a defect and started treating it as a form of knowledge, is not someone who has solved the problem of being human. They are someone who has found a particular kind of honesty about what it costs them to move through the world and what it gives them in return. That honesty is not a small thing. In a culture that is almost allergically opposed to silence, the person who can sit with stillness, who can hold complexity without rushing to resolve it, who can observe without immediately reacting, that person carries something genuinely rare. Not a superpower, not a curse. A way of being that, when understood and protected rather than suppressed and apologized for, becomes one of the most reliable sources of self-knowledge available. And self-knowledge, as both the Stoics and Jung understood in their very different ways, is where everything else begins. And if this spoke to a part of you that rarely gets heard, stay with that feeling for a moment. You are not broken because you feel deeply. You are only beginning to understand yourself. Subscribe to Inside the Labyrinth for more reflections on the hidden patterns of the human mind.